Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
And welcome back, everybody. We are, as a society, fascinated with horror stories. There's so many movies, TV shows, books that center around scaring us. And it's fun. Today is Halloween when we're doing this show. Might not be when you're watching it, but we're going to center today on how to write a good Halloween story, a horror story on Halloween, as we focus with this gentleman who's helped people write all types of stories. He's got a great publishing company called NFB Publishing, and we're going to dig down. We're going to get a little scary here today. Mark Pogozinski joins us. How you doing today?
Good. How are you feeling?
Good, good. This is, I think back to so many different movies that we've seen and how they made us feel and what made it work within that story. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is making it believable, making it believable. And there's so many different scenarios out there, but am I in the right path there that you're not going to get scared unless you feel it, like you're believing the story?
I think that's an important aspect of it. It's putting someone in a position where they have no control or power,
Mm.
where they have to run, whether it be from like a killer or an alien. And like for your example, setting it in the everyday, um, is a great way to go about it. As someone's trying to write a horror story, um, you look to like what you enjoyed in terms of scary, in terms of what frightened you, and that usually is a good track to start your project. We can go like to the classic like Halloween, suburban town, babysitter, watching the kids on Halloween, and then we add the villain, and the villain is unstoppable. You have to run. They put different situations where you think you're safe, and I think that's where you get your best jump scares, where the audience thinks that something else is going to happen, and then you give them something to terrify them. That classic jump scare, and it's tough to do with writing too, because again, someone's reading a book, they're not, watching it happen. There's no music behind it, so it's a great way to go about writing a story, especially if you're interested in that genre, but it's not an easy road to get someone to jump scare with a book, or toss the book aside and like go tell someone what they just read and like, oh my God, I'm never going to get that out of my mind. And that that's a goal from all authors, right? To have something embedded in someone's mind. For the horror writer, it's something scary or terrifying. And I like the idea of the everyday, and I like the idea of giving someone a scene that they know and changing it. And that's, if you look at Stephen King, that's what he used. He took everything that you loved as a kid, your
Hmm.
dog, your car, your prom, and he ruined it.
Wow.
A good horror writer will do that, taking something that you cherished and twisting it so now that you're terrified of it.
I never thought about the challenge of a book because if it's a movie, TV show, series, you've got lots to work with to help scare. The music alone
Mm.
can amp it up. When it's a book, it's your eyes and your mind, and that's it. So it seems like that is the bigger challenge of all of this.
I think that also the novel is more difficult. A short story collection, I think, is easier. And if again you use Stephen King as an example, he starts off as a short story writer, because it's difficult to maintain that tension over 300, 400 pages. And if you want to become a novelist, again, a great way to start is that short story, especially if you're going to do suspense or horror or even crime fiction. Um, can have elements of terror to it, suspense, and like those jumps. Or when someone has to reread something, did I read that correctly? Oh my God, I can't believe that happened to that character. I mean, those are all positive things that the writer wants the reader to experience. Okay, and again, it's a stereotype that horror writers and mystery writers are just a little bit off, because they spend their days thinking about terrible things.
Hmm.
How do I terrify like them? How do I terrify Steve right now? Is there someone behind him? The light flashes. This is what we think about. You're going about your day and like, okay, what would happen if a monster showed up? What would the monster look like? Would it be fast? Would it be slow? What's more terrifying to my audience?
It's amazing when you think back to some of the things that have worked in movies. Like one of them, Saw, right? There's so
Yep.
many, a number of different ones. Um, the premise is essentially same. The other one, Human Centipede. Remember that
Ugh.
one?
I
Uh,
mean, again, someone made that movie. I always wonder about that pitch session. Like, hey, I got an idea. What's your idea? Well, I'm gonna take people and I'm gonna sew them together. And they're like, all right,
right.
great. Here's some money. Let's go make this.
Yeah. Mouth to other body part to other body part to mouth, blah, blah, blah. But it was scary though. When and I actually was flipping through and I saw it again and I'm like, well, let me watch this again. And when you think about, people sewn together having to, you know, move together because they're connected together, um, the relatability, I believe, is key. Where you put yourself in that situation, what would I do? How would I be able to survive in all of these different situations? Do you think that's what it comes down to? You're putting yourself there.
I think you want to, what will terrify you the most? Like, what is your deepest, darkest fear? And then you start from that. Um, One of my favorite horror writers is Shirley Jackson, who wrote all sorts of different short stories. Her most famous is probably The Lottery, which has this fantastically deceptive ending where you don't see it coming. And she wrote House on Haunted Hill, which has been turned into many different movies. And again, Netflix just redid it last year. So it shows the longevity of her concept. But hers is not gory. Hers is not shock value. It's psychological. It's
Mhm.
about normal people and what would you do if the situation calls for you to do something horrible and the entire society is doing something horrible, would you go along with it? If it's the natural thing to do harm to people, and you read in the story, and then you start thinking about like, well, what do I do on a daily basis that does harm? She puts you in those situations where it's a moral ambiguity combined with horror, with the supernatural. And I always thought that was a fascinating way to go. It's I don't think it's easy to do that, but I like that idea. I like that moral ambiguity combined with my horror. Like with the human centipede, what was the motivation for those characters to do that? And then again, it's an interesting idea. I would love to have seen that pitch session
Yeah,
where
right.
someone comes on like, "This is my idea," and you're like, "I've never seen that, so I guess we're gonna give that a thumbs up." So
Mm.
I think that's a great analogy, a great story.
It's gory though,
Oh
and I,
yeah.
I I see your point where psychological is something different. It's almost like when you see a comedian, and there are some that get a little raw, and use certain language and whatever works for them. But then there's other ones where they can be funny without even saying anything dirty, risque, whatever it might be. To me, that's the psychological part of what we're talking about. Um, can we look at some of the titles that you have?
Yeah.
Helped
I,
publish is
I do
scarier.
think you bring up a good point about that line between shock gore and horror. We see it crossed a lot in movies and books, and I guess it depends on the type of author that you want to be. Um,
Mm,
you had a couple books where it is a shock gore, and that's what they were going for, and other books that were more subtle. Again, I'm a big fan of the short story genre when it comes to horror and terror books. So we did one Restless Nights as a short story collection, 13 Tales, of course, of the Macabre. And again, these were a little bit more high end, a little bit more Edgar Allan Poe and what they were trying to get to without the shock horror of it. We had another one of Darkness and Deathless, which had horror aspects, but wasn't a horror book. And I think those aspects punctuated the plot. Like you're reading along, it's a little psychological, it's a little philosophical, and then wham, there's a scene of hyper violence, and it keeps you off kilter. So I thought those are excellent examples. A couple other like mysteries we've done in the past. We've done multiple murder mysteries. And again, you got to put yourself in the frame of mind of a murderer to write those things as well as a detective. So it's always interesting to see what people produce. Um, I don't see as many horror books as I used to.
Mm.
But we do see it in different other genres like TV, movies. We did another great one called The Face of a Monster, which was about the beginnings of a serial killer, someone who, was abused, had to deal with it a certain way, and then, it's an interesting psychological take on it. If I'm dehumanized, then everything is dehumanized around me. If I find no value in myself, how can I find value in other people? So there was a darker, deeper aspect to that. And again, some of those, I like those that have a little bit more. They have the gore, but they have a little bit more underneath. And I think those are interesting books to read.
With those, how much input did you have or did you need to give uh, within the writing of the book?
Those are tough. If someone wants to do like a violent scene and it works for the plot, like I said, Darkless and Deathless, it punctuated the plot. It wasn't there for shock value, but we've had other submissions where like, you know what, this is way over the top. You're bordering on abuse, you're bordering on
Uh,
different things that I don't think you want to include. And then the writers are sometimes shocked, like that's not at all what I wanted to do. Well, that's the way it's coming across. So we need to build some scenes around your violent scene to help the reader understand what you're trying to get to. And some of those take a long time because it's difficult to have those violent scenes for that shock value and yet still humanize your characters because in the end you want the reader to hate, love, empathize with at least one of your characters. And I think you'll see that in horror movies, you'll see that in horror shows. There's one character that you're supposed to be along the ride with, like this person. I'm with this person. They're running, they're scared, they're losing friends right and left, but they remain the main character. And I think that's important, like an anchor, because you can't just have all gore,
mm,
especially with the book. You read 25 pages of violence, 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 violence.
yeah,
Eventually, you're going to be like, I'm done.
yeah,
I can't continue. And where you can get up and go to the bathroom for a movie or TV show with a book, you put it down, you might never pick it back up, and then you lose your readers.
yeah. I can see that. Like it's violence overload where and I think that's where the ebb and the flow makes it fun and exciting, like a roller coaster, as opposed to you just being slammed with violence. Isn't it interesting the symbolism that comes from a lot of the famous stories? When I say this picture, what do you think of? Red balloon, sewer grates.
Yeah.
It's
And
amazing.
he's the master, right? Stephen King. There are if you read his books, there are certain tropes that he always uses, putting children in danger,
Mm,
cemetery,
mm.
you know, automatic empathy, automatic, I want to protect these children, automatic, I'm worried about what's going to happen to them. And then once he has you with that, then he can start manipulating the fear. Then he can start adding the monster or in the case of Pet Cemetery, the adult making the terrible decision about trying to resurrect something that shouldn't be resurrected. But it starts with that first initial child in danger. Cujo is another one. Empathy built in right away. And when I do talk to horror writers and people are going to try and that, I steer them towards Stephen King. Look at what he does. Look at the built-in empathy that he's creating in the first chapter, the first few pages. Then we start getting into the horror. Then we can start getting into the darkness. And I think people want to jump in without establishing those anchor characters, those characters that I want to care about, that I'm worried that something's going to happen to them. Because without them, it's 400 pages of violence, violence, violence.
Do you still react the way you did even years ago? You're exposed uh, to so many different stories. and you look at it through the lens of a publisher as well. But would you be sitting there in front of the TV watching maybe something you haven't seen or maybe something you haven't seen in a long time, and do you feel that anxiety like, no, no, yeah, are you does that still happen to you?
I don't get those visceral reactions anymore because I just, I'm a horror fan. I like horror movies. Um, so I don't get that anymore. But what I get is like, huh, that's an interesting way to go about to establish that empathy. And I go back to Pet Sematary. If you've never read the book is incredibly dark and sad and awful. And when I read it now as a parent, I empathize with different characters. Yeah, I'm not shocked by what happens because I know what happens because I've read the book. I'm like, oh, I can see the motivation of this character a little bit more clearer than I did in my 20s when I wasn't a parent. So I think a good horror will do that. You can reread it or rewatch it, and your empathy changes. When you were a kid, you watch Halloween, it was like, oh man, this is gonna be great. Michael Myers, he's like the best. And now, as a parent, you're like, no, I want someone to stop him because the children and the babysitter and that I want them to survive.
Right.
So I think again, good horror will do that. It'll change as you change, and you'll see different things in it.
I have to watch that again because it's been some time. But when I think about that story and the visuals, back in the day, it was like, and now it's almost like a comedy in some regards because it's
Yeah.
older. You know what I mean? It almost kind of turned into a parody of itself, but there's still scare elements. Um, I get wrapped up in stories. I can be watching, and not even a horror story, but just a drama, and I'm like, okay, all good. I'm like, no, wait a minute, get out there. You could do this. I get sucked in. I really do.
And you want to, right? You want a good
Yeah,
story should do that. And again, with Halloween presents an automatic setting of fear, of heightened anxiety, of children out there in the
sure.
world, dressed up, in danger. And it's such an interesting holiday. It goes back to the Celts, and there's a lot of different aspects to it that lend itself to a good horror movie. And I think this time of year, especially where I live, when the leaves are rustling and the wind is blowing and the moon is being covered by a cloud. I mean, these are classic tropes for a horror movie, a scary movie. And as you say, if it's a classic one, it'll be parodied, it'll be remade. Like Frankenstein, Frankenstein's Monster is a great black and white movie. It became the archetype for that character, and yet another one's coming out because the story still resonates. I don't want to die. I want to bring back the people who died because I
Yep.
love them. What am I willing to sacrifice? And then we add the horror elements to it. So you have that base, interesting story of a human need. I don't want to die. I don't want I love to die. What am I willing to do? And then we have the horror elements, as I said.
Do you feel the key of all of this is us putting ourselves in their position?
You have to, right? There has to be some human element, some desire, base desire that we're trying to accomplish, and things go terribly, terribly wrong. Survival is usually your easiest one to do, Friday the 13th, Halloween, Scream. But then you do have like more things. The mad professor who wants to save something or save himself, herself. What are you willing to give up? What taboos are you willing to break to gain whatever you want, whether it's immortality or bringing back the life of a child, like Pet Cemetery? How far are you willing to go? And I think a good author will take us on that journey to that point where we're like, you know what? I can only almost see myself if I had lost a child. What would I do to get that child back? And that's a great story. And then
Mm,
we add all the terror elements to it.
wow. That's gonna be the top of my revisit list. And I'm gonna share that with my daughter who's 16 as well. Because she loves those types of movies. Probably, it's been decades. She's
There's
probably
an
not.
80s version, and then there's a modern version of Pet Cemetery. And I read an interview with King where he talked about it, and he's like, I am shocked I wrote this book this book is almost offensive, and I don't remember certain parts to it. So he was even appalled that his younger self would even think of such a thing. And now, older in life, you're apparently like, I would never, ever, ever write this story. So again, that generational gap, we will see new things. And horror is a cool genre to do that. You don't think of it that way, but horror books sell, horror movies always do well. TV shows, people enjoy
Sure.
them.
The new version of Pet Cemetery or the newest, what's your opinion? I haven't seen it. I'm curious.
Uh, the director, I thought, did a good job. It has a nice creepiness factor. They change a little bit to give you hope, I think, trying to give you that shock value, because people have read the book and seen the old movie. They changed it a little bit, but it still has that. And again, for me, it was as different as I get older. What am I willing to do to save a child? And if he's King, the same thing. It's in It, it's in Cujo, it's in The Mist. It's an easy way to build empathy with your audience. Like, what would you willing to do to save someone you love? Would you willing to do something horrible to somebody else if
Mm.
you had to? And what a great question, and it's a basic question of, parents everywhere. And then we start the terror elements to it, and we start showing like all good intentions eventually go wrong.
Would you say, let's pivot away from horror for just a moment. Would you say that you are somewhat obsessed in watching movies, shows, just checking things out?
Me personally,
Yeah.
yes,
Okay.
as a
So
pick one.
next question, and the final question: what are you watching now? What's on your radar? Maybe two shows, two series, maybe a movie you saw recently. Um, that you saw. Like, what did you pick?
I enjoyed Usher of late, which is in that horror genre where the director, the writer took Edgar Allan Poe stories and reimagined them as a full plot line about a family called the Ushers. It's violent. It's got some really dark stuff to it. But again, because I've seen so much, the violence didn't really get to me. It was the cleverness of taking an established property, characters that appear in all sorts of different Poe stories, and reimagining that as a coherent plot line. And I thought
Wow.
it was a wonderfully well written show, had that nice, cool shock value. And because as I get older, my attention span is not what it used to be. It was a limited series.
I'm kind of the opposite in that regard. I don't watch TV. I don't watch, I just don't. And because I was sick a couple of weeks ago, I got bitten by the TV bug, and now I'm like, all right, I'm gonna watch a series. I'm gonna watch that. And what does I watch? I watch currently watching Old Man, which is Jeff Bridges.
Mhm.
And at first, I just clicked it on. I'm like, interesting. I thought it was just about an old man's life until I realized that he was a, former CIA operative and is still, retired but dealing with situations. And now I've gotten sucked into it. I'm on to season two. So I was watching that last night, but fairly well put together. John Lithgow is also part of it. But it's interesting, even when you look at it from a storytelling aspect, some of the things that are done in all different types of stories. Like when you start dissecting it, I try not to, but I
I,
do.
I I don't think it's a bad thing. Like, you want to pull it apart, you want to see like why I liked it. Like, I watched that one too. I liked him as a character.
Yeah.
I like the reluctant gunman. You go back to Westerns. The person who just wants to live a peaceful life but is sucked back into a world of violence. It's a common trope, but it works for me. And again, I think as I get older, it makes more sense to me as
Yeah.
I respond to these older characters who just
Yes.
want peace but can't get it. And then you pop it with some violence and some clever plot twists, and you're like, oh, you know what? It's been 6 hours and I've watched 6 episodes, and I will
Totally.
watch the seventh.
And in that one show, the final thought here, he, somebody else within the CIA was pitted against him. Now you go to season two, spoiler alert, they're together and they're in Afghanistan. What the heck happened here?
And then
Like,
you want to watch it, right?
yeah. At first I was like, no, no, it was more fun when they were against each other. But now it's almost like these two old men in a way, paired, against the rest of the world, trying to find somebody who's missing. And it's, again, there's the roller coaster. Didn't expect that. Didn't see that one coming. Um,
We call it puzzle pieces. Okay, like
hmm,
a writer has a puzzle, the writer pulls it apart, and I'm going to show you this piece, and I'm going to show you this piece. And as you watch a show or read a book, the puzzle pieces come together, and you're rewarded for paying attention.
right.
I'm a big fan of that too. I like
Mm.
that a lot.
Never thought of it that way. This is what you do. You help people who have never written a book, or maybe some have dabbled in it, get it done from the beginning to the end, right down to the amazing cover art. And the website's easy to find, nfbpublishing.com. If you've ever thought to become published, have ideas for stories, reach out. If that's your passion, go for it. Sounds like fun. It really does. Great having you on here again, Mark. And we never talked horror, and quite interesting today to go down that road.
All right. Thank you so much. Happy Halloween.
Same. We'll be right back.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.